to our session, our workshop here. So you see Christine and myself down on the bottom there. The top row is Courtney, Dina, and Carlos, again, former directors of admissions, senior admissions officers. And the bottom left, Dr. Scott Wright, again, another former director of admissions. He used to run the whole Texas application service as well. So you're surrounded by some good people, the two best today, if I do say so myself. We're going to talk a lot about mindset today because, Christine, this is a very stressful time for students, yeah?
Oh my gosh, it's the worst. It's the worst.
Yeah. So terrible. We're going to talk about.
It is.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying it is. It's been this way for the last few months, and there's a couple months left.
Yeah. There's some left. All right. We're going to talk about the timeline, what that looks like, especially for those who are in the current cycle. How many of you, we'll try this again. How many of you are in the current cycle and waiting to find out? We heard already from Danielle. Danielle's had interviews. How many of you are in the current cycle maybe and don't have any interviews? And so maybe it's a certainty that you're reapplying. Hopefully Danielle gets off a wait list or something. So we'll see what happens there. Go ahead and chat and let us know. All right. And then we're going to talk about qualitative versus quantitative, or as you'll see later on, I renamed them subjective versus objective stuff. I like subjective versus objective better. So, Jagadish, my daughter is in current cycle. She has done interviews.
Interviews? That's what it looks like.
She has had interviews.
She says she does have interviews.
Okay. And she does have interviews. Yeah. So that's fantastic, but no word yet on acceptance. So, Christine, it is January 23rd, 2025. Students applied, does not have interviews yet. She clarified there. They clarified there. Okay, good to know.
Okay.
Current cycle have not received any interview invites, says Asher. Thank you, Asher, for letting us know. All right. 2 waitlisted in college. All right. January 23rd, 2025. It is getting late. Students applied back in May, June, maybe a little bit later. At what point do they say there's no hope?
If they have no interviews, I would not say you have no hope, but it's a very slim, I mean, the hope is dwindling. So I think now is really the time to start assessing your application and thinking about what's next.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's not impossible. I get shocked every year. Something surprises me, but in general, my argument is interview invites are probably for the most part out, even if they're still interviewing for another month or so.
Okay.
For the most part, the invites are going out or have gone out. I mean, I don't think there's been that many new invites that are pending.
Yeah. So if you're waiting on interviews, probably going to continue waiting because it's probably very unlikely for new interviews to come out. Maybe potentially if a student gets gets their dream acceptance and they have another interview that they scheduled, maybe they cancel that interview and that opens up a spot. So that's where some movement may come. So
yeah.
We say here, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. A lot of students wait until May when those final rejections come out and they go, okay, I guess I need to reapply. Let me work on my application and turn it around. And they're basically applying with the same application if they haven't prepared for the worst. What does that mean?
Well, I guess the question I would ask is, if you're applying with the same application with minimal to no change, what's going to be different about the new cycle rather than the old cycle?
Yeah. As Einstein says, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, but expecting different results. Don't do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just having this conversation with a student earlier. She was asking about reapplication statistics. And I said, the only data that I know of is that reapplicants, their acceptance rate is only about 25% compared to 40-ish% for the applicants overall. And
Mm-hmm.
I said a lot of people will look at that number and immediately think that being a reapplicant is bad, but
Right.
there's no context with that number. Is it a reapplicant with the same application, or is it a reapplicant with an improved application, or potentially even a reapplicant with a worse application because they did a postback and they didn't do well, or something like that?
So many factors.
So
Yeah.
there's so many factors and so much context that goes into looking at numbers like that. So I guess first thing off the bat is just reassurance to all of you who potentially may need to reapply, is that being a reapplicant is not a bad thing.
Right.
Don't worry about it. With one caveat, the only one that I know of, although they might have changed, Harvard, as far as I know, only wants you to apply to their school twice. They're like, don't apply to us any more than twice. We're not going to consider you.
I mean, there, okay.
Okay. I bet you AMCAS still lets you add Harvard. Like if you're fifth time around, they're going to take the money. You just
Sure.
won't hear anything from Harvard. So
That's fine.
oh, lovely. Adam asks, will every school give an explicit rejection, or is it more likely some will never say anything? Yeah, most won't say
It,
anything, and then maybe the day school starts, they'll reject everyone. We
Yep.
talk about this a lot as a team. I hate it.
Yep.
I hate it.
I used to do it, so I can't even.
You're part of the problem.
I was part of the problem. I can remember like the third day of medical school was when we would like send our AMCAS rejections and stuff. So
Yeah.
I did it. I know it.
Yeah. Samantha asked a question about is there any difference between MD and DO, right? This time of the cycle, is there maybe more hope for DO interview invites, new invites to
Maybe.
come out? And I don't know.
But I think, I mean, I would argue across the board, chances are slim. I mean, I think
Yeah.
we're coming because again, all the applications reopen in May. So most schools are on their downslide. They're finishing this up. And the people that they're likely going to pull from is going to be from the people they interviewed and placed on a wait list at this point.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Let's keep rocking here. The slideshow that we have is relatively short. The goal of this session is to answer as many questions as we can to provide you with some more direct feedback on the process. I think this is something that we harp on a lot, and we try to get students to really understand with this process, that there's no one perfect path, right? Getting into medical school, there are lots of different ways to do it. And even for a student who hasn't gotten into medical school this cycle, the next steps are going to be completely unique for each student, depending on maybe why they didn't get into med school this time and what their resources are moving forward.
I would agree.
Okay. So with that said, right, everyone's a little bit unique. How many of you have applied more than once? That'd be an interesting question. Any multiple application people in here and still waiting to get in? I would love to know that. All right. So mindset, right? Christine, applying to medical school, it's long, it's hard, it's expensive. And putting yourself out there and being rejected, I'm one of those people, right? I had to apply to medical school twice. And first time around, I didn't know anything about getting into medical school. My advisor at University of Florida was not helpful to me, so I was doing it alone. I came from a household where my mom and my stepdad, who I lived with, didn't graduate high school. So I was not one that was well resourced and knowledgeable, and the internet wasn't as robust as it is today. Not to date myself, but after getting two interviews and being rejected from both schools, it felt like someone was telling me, the world was telling me, that I wasn't meant to be a physician. But that's not the message, right?
Mm-mm. Yeah, it doesn't have to be the message. I mean, I do talks a lot about readiness. I mean, readiness is just something I'm truly believe in. And I have the conversation of you don't apply until you're ready. So I don't the arbitrariness of a pre-med deadline or timeline is the readiness factor. Somebody who's a junior may be more ready than somebody who is 2 years out in a gap year. It just really depends on what you bring to the table and how you put it together. And so maybe the first time you applied, I don't know what your application looked like or what you wrote, it may not have been ready. It may not have been well presented. You don't know. And then you obviously figured it out.
Mhm.
Um, but readiness, I mean, that's the timeline. It's you have to look at where you are in time and space with everything and determine whether or not you're ready.
Yeah.
And that's the same
Yeah,
for a reapplicant.
100%. Yeah. And I think reapplicants often potentially go wrong with rushing. They're like, "Oh my gosh, I just wasted
I
a
gotta go
year.
now.
If I don't reapply this year, I'm going to waste another year." When in reality, you have to move when you're ready, not just
Yeah,
because the clock is ticking.
right.
So,
I think that's the hardest message to hear.
yeah. Yeah. We're going to dive into kind of those next thoughts on what potentially went wrong in an application. And when it comes to the objective stuff, right? The quantitative, the things that we can measure.
Yeah.
Stats are a big one, right?
Yeah.
Submission date is a big one. Where they applied, MDDO, TMDSS is a big one. We had one student just mention multiple reapplicant here. If I had to judge my main issue, timing was a big problem. And
That's huge.
there's
I don't think people really realize that.
it's huge. And I've used this quote a bunch. I stole it from some professor, I think at the NIH, if I remember correctly. He talked about applying to medical school being your first med school test. And it's an open book test. And applying late is a failed test. You failed your first
Agreed.
test in med school. And so it's so important. Talk about the importance of applying on time or earlier in the application cycle.
So I don't think people account for the verification process. And I'll talk specifically about AMCAS, the MD application, because that's really the one that's the longest.
Yeah.
Um, when you hit the button to submit, your application does not go to the med schools. You have not applied really yet. You are
Yep.
just in process. There is generally somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 6 weeks between the time you submit to the time that the schools will receive your application.
Mm-hmm.
And so for those who apply, and let me clarify, on time and early and in a reasonable time is early June, mid-June ish.
Mm-hmm.
Please do not have the takeaway message that you have to apply on May 28th or June 1st or whatever the first day is
Yeah.
at
Within the first 5 minutes, or you're late.
12:01 a.m. or yeah, that is not the case either. So let's not go to the extreme OCD side of it either. Um, my comfort zone, and this is what I generally tell the students I work with, I like June 15th, June 10th. I mean, that mid-June range, we're
Yep.
groovy. And we start counting out the weeks. And I really do count weeks with them. I'm like, if you apply here, they're still in verification. By the time the schools get it, you're looking at maybe mid-July. But if you have spent time really doing your pre-writing and getting your secondaries done, you turn those around, you're probably getting everything in late July, early August. That is great. That's right on time. There's no med school that's ready to go on July 1st either. I mean,
Yep.
again, I've been on that side. I've been that person going, oh my God, we're not ready yet. And you're scrambling. So, but when you apply on June 1st, May 28th, June 2nd, you're going to that 4 weeks. And so no school's going to receive your application before like June 28th. Usually that's that first, whatever that last Friday of June is usually when it sends out. and then the schools will trigger their secondaries.
Mhm.
And it takes time to write secondaries. I truly believe that we all underestimate the time it takes to write a good secondary. And so you think you're going to turn 30 or 35 schools around in 2 weeks. You're not doing that either. So
Yeah,
everything is a
maybe with
time game.
ChatGPT.
Yeah, please. Yes, let's do it that way. And so you got to just always add 4 weeks here, 2 weeks there, 2 weeks more, and add it out. So you potentially, if you apply on, God help me, June 30th, July 1st, July 15th, the school might not even get your application and get you into a queue for actual review until mid to late September
Mhm.
or later, because they're not going to review anything until your secondaries are in, your letters are in, and all those things. And they've already started interviewing at that point.
Yeah.
And you have to start accounting for when do they start interviewing? When do they start their invites? Now they've probably invited through October. And if you're that one that's really going to give me anxiety and tell me you want to apply in August after you've taken some July MCAT, my anxiety is out the roof now. I need to start taking medication because I know that your application is not going to hit until September or October,
Yeah.
which means your review is probably not until December, January. I mean, it just takes that long. It takes time to get there.
A couple questions on that, and one clarification that I was able to get from AMCAS directly. Right, we're talking about AMCAS. Their verification process is the longest out of everyone. AMCAS, the schools themselves do have an option to receive applications or have access to applications before they're verified. Now, what schools actually do that, I don't know.
I think
But
Yale
that,
does.
yeah, I think that students get thrown off sometimes. They're like, I just submitted and I got a secondary request the next day and it's not
Right.
verified yet. I'm like, yeah, that can happen. So you just be aware that after the access window opens, which is typically third or fourth week of June every year, if you submit after that time, you potentially can get secondaries immediately, depending on the school. You mentioned, right, students who might take an MCAT later, might apply later by the time secondaries are back and the MCAT score is in and letters of recommendations are there. So the application is complete. What if a student has a 4.0 GPA and a 528 MCAT? Are they like flagged for immediate review because the school is like, hey, this person might be someone special?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, when I was looking at MCATs or applications, and I will tell you, the applications I used to review when I was screening for interview was high MCATers, like the ones
Yeah.
that really were high performers. That just is the one that was delegated to me. And so I literally read them in the order they arrived in my queue. So if you applied on June 1st, and that means you submitted on July 3rd or whatever, your turnaround was, that was the first one that had come up, and I just went down the line. I would argue probably most admissions committee people, they're not necessarily flagging. They're literally just going down the line of people.
Yep.
Now, the deans of admissions or certain committee members, maybe they're looking for something,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't bank on it.
Okay. Yeah, and that's one of those. Maybe at some schools they're doing it, but other schools might not. So kind of a
Yeah.
useless question at the end of the day.
The
So
other thing we
timing,
have to
right?
remember too is deadlines. See, schools give deadlines that
I
are
hate it.
completely useless.
Yeah. Yeah, I did. I gave a talk several years ago, actually, where I met Courtney and Dr. Wright in person for the first time in Toronto. And part of that talk was the discussion around the talk was medical schools need to be more transparent. And so I had a team member at the time go to, I think, 100 different medical school websites and look, right? You mentioned deadlines. Look at where they talked about deadlines and how many of them, when talking about deadlines, also said, by the way, we use rolling admissions, so applying earlier is better, whatever context they want to give there. And it was only about a quarter of the 100 schools that we looked at that mentioned anything about that. And so it's not that a quarter of the schools used rolling admissions, because almost every school does rolling admissions, uses rolling
Right.
admissions, but 75% of the schools weren't transparent about that. And to me, that is just unacceptable.
Agreed.
So,
Agreed. Because I've
yeah,
had many students say, well, their deadline's not till October
yeah,
1st or November 1st. I'm like, I couldn't tell you deadlines for schools if you gave
yeah.
me lots of money to do it. I'm like, I don't know. I just know you need to get it in early.
Yeah, it's easy. October 1st, October 15th, November 1st, November 15th. It's usually those. Somewhere
Right.
around
I
there.
know they fall in that range. I just know they're
Yep.
useless. So
Yep.
I
They are
don't know them.
useless. Yeah. And it's a change from college admissions, because college admissions
Totally.
isn't rolling admissions. So it's
Yeah.
make sure you're doing that. I have on here MDDO, TMDSAS. When students potentially come in with this mindset of, I only want to be an MD, I don't want to be a DO, or I'm only applying Texas, I don't want to apply elsewhere. Students are allowed to have that opinion, right? But
Yeah, they are.
it may hurt them in their application because they're limiting the potential options. Talk for a second about the benefit of applying broadly and what that means and why it's important.
And so applying broadly, I okay, so I'll tell you the situation here working at MSHQ with this team. I'm the California person. Y'all are going to get to know me. If you ever look at my bio, people gravitate me because I'm from California schools. So I cannot tell you how many people I have a conversation with that say, I only want to go to a California school. And I'm like, yeah, that's not going to happen. So let's
Yeah.
I level set that quickly. So applying broadly is recognizing the level of competitiveness all of these schools bring. There is no safety school, there's no easy school, there's no guaranteed school. I don't care. Unless you are like, there are certain small schools, maybe you're a state resident and they know that if you perform at this, you get an automatic interview or something to that degree. There are very, very few guarantees and safeties. And so I think students should apply broadly. You need to look at various states. You need to look at various programs. MD and DO, I personally think the stigma that is arbitrarily and dumbly attached to this is stupid.
Yep.
They're both physicians. They're both very well respected. I don't know what else to say about that, but I don't know why you wouldn't apply. The matches merged. There's so many different things that are actually evolving in the right way for MDDO that it doesn't make sense to me not to apply, but I get it. People don't want to do that. And then Texas, the TMDSAS, if you're a Texas resident, I do think you definitely want to apply TMDSAS, but then you may also want to apply to other schools outside of Texas because, again, it's all competitive. There are only a finite number of spots. And if again, the California students, I think I tried to count them up one time, and there's probably in the neighborhood of 1,800 to 2,000 spots in the state of California for a med student. 200 here, 50 there, 100 there. You start adding up. There are not that many for the number of med schools that are here.
Yeah.
And 8 to 10,000 people are trying to vie for that same exact spot to each school. What makes you think you're going to be like that less than 1% they're going to choose? You have to assume you're not.
Yeah.
And so you do want to like cast your net. I met with someone yesterday. They had applied very broadly. She even said it. And she had like 9 interviews, 2 acceptances, and all these things. And I was like, I don't know what all you did, but you did a really good job at it. Because our meeting, it was the best meeting I get to have. It's how do I choose what schools to go to? I'm like, yes, let's have that conversation. And
Yeah.
so, but this person applied far and wide.
Yeah. Apply broadly, my friends. Apply broadly. GPA and trends there.
Yep.
One of the things when I'm looking at an application and trying to understand what went wrong here, a student may have a 3.5 GPA cumulative, which isn't great.
Mm-hmm.
It's not terrible. It's just kind of okay.
Yeah.
But when I actually look at their GPA trend, they started off with a 4.0, and then they went to a 3.9, and then they went to a 3.2, and then they went to a 3.1. And I'm like, okay, what's going on
Why the dip?
here? How does that picture the trends and what's going on, whether they did a post-bac or an SMP or some other master's program, how does that come into play when a student's evaluating, like, why didn't I get in this cycle?
So GPA trends, dips, and things like that. You certainly want to, I have like my own internal metrics of how I would advise on when to seek out post-bac or special masters and various things like that. And in general, like a 3.5 GPA, they probably don't need a special master's program, but hopefully they were able to explain, if you go with the scenario you gave where they started off strong and dipped, something happened. And life happens. I can attest to that, unfortunately, way too well. And so sometimes you just have to say it. Life happened. I had some struggles. That's where the other impactful experiences comes in. And you're able to talk about what that is. What you don't want to do is leave a question. Did you just stop going to class junior, senior year and your GPA dipped that drastically? Or did something truly happen that really can kind of offset and mitigate? So first and foremost, be a little bit more transparent with that. However, if it's the reverse where you start off low and you have an upward trend where maybe you started off college like I did, not so well. Maybe, I was not the best college student out of the gate. But I worked my way and figured it out. That's an upward trend. Upward trends are really good. And so you could have a 3.5 GPA and do very well because you have demonstrated you figured yourself out, that your last 2 years or 3 semesters or whatever the case is, you did very well. That's kind of the whole purpose of a post-bac, is to start demonstrating and allaying the fears of an admissions committee that you can handle the curriculum.
Yeah. What about the
So,
yo-yo? Razwana is asking, what about the yo-yo in the GPA? The roller coaster, I like to call it.
it's honestly, that's probably where I would encourage you, depending on what your numbers are. I'd probably encourage you to do post-bac and go up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because
The
again, you're
question
not
is, are
lending the
they getting this
confidence.
student or this student? The
Right.
valleys or the peaks?
And they don't know. And they don't know.
Yep.
And I would argue they're risk averse. They are risk averse. They're not going to take the
Yep.
risk because there's too many other people they can be confident with.
Yep. Yeah. And it hurts them to accept someone who doesn't get through medical school.
I had that job too. Not good. Not good.
Yeah, you Donald Trump them, you're fired.
Oh, don't ever compare me to that. But yes, I have been in the meeting where we have had to send students, and it's the worst
Yeah.
meeting ever. The
Yeah.
worst.
A lot of students will reflexively think their MCAT score is the issue and go and
Oh,
retake the MCAT.
yeah. Yeah.
How can we objectively say you need to retake your MCAT? Or is that possible at all?
I don't. Again, this goes back to what you talked about with Courtney and Scott when you first met them and the lack of transparency. I do think there is a clear lack of transparency with this because you don't
Mhm.
know 100%. I don't know that I would ever be able to confidently tell a student with absolute certainty that they should or should not retake in certain cases because it's the what if game on so many levels. I think I would look at what what does the school say? If they don't accept or consider anyone with an MCAT below a 500, guarantee if you get a below a 500, you have to retake, things like that. I usually tell students to step back a minute before a retake because inevitably, very much like a reapplication, they realize in May they got to reapply, so they reapply in June. I've had students get a score in May and say, okay, I retested in June and got the same score. I'm like, shocking. See the shock? I'm like, what was going to be different? You didn't even give yourself time to study.
Yeah.
And so that would be my same argument is you got to like spend the time and think about what went wrong or what went right. And then how can you improve it? What are additional practice tests telling you? Use some as objective metrics as you possibly can. But I don't know if there's ever a perfect thing because I've also had students going, I know I can do better. The cars section is obviously the score killer for a lot of our students.
Mhm.
And I've had students going, I know I can do better in cars. I'm like, you are an adult. You are welcome to retake, but I need you to just know what the potential ramifications to that are.
Yeah.
And I've seen students go from like a 508 to a 512 because they knew and they trusted themselves.
Yeah.
So, we have to have the conversation, I think, to kind of see what your thought process is on why you're planning to retake. Certainly a quick retake.
Yeah. Um, Lots of deciding factors there. I'll talk to students that are like, "Oh my gosh, I got a 505." I'm like, "Well, what were you hoping for?" And they're like, "A 507." I'm like, "A 505 exactly is the same as a
Same
507."
confidence band, yeah.
Yeah. Or they may go, "Oh, I was scoring 520s on all my full length exams." Then I'm like, "Well,
What
haven't you
happened?
retaken the test already? Like, is that 520 real because you remembered the answers from the previous time?" So there's so many variables again that go
Yep,
into this. And sometimes I'll tell a student, look, you knew your stuff, you had a bad day, go and retake it as quickly as possible
exactly.
and hope. So
Exactly.
Rhonda has a question. What if I have a high MCAT with a 2.8 GPA and an upward trend? Do you still need a postback? Rhonda, I think it depends on how long that upward trend is. Is the upward trend um, uh, uh, for a semester? Is it for 2 semesters? Is it 10 credits? Is it 40 credits? Are they all science classes versus non-science classes? There's so many variables there. An MPH, she responded back. An MPH does nothing to help your academic confidence in the medical school's confidence in your academic ability, since
It
it's
doesn't.
not hard sciences. And unfortunately, I see so many students who do an MPH just kind of reflexively going, "Oh, I didn't get into med school. I'll do an MPH, and that's going to help me get in." I'm like, "Oh no, like let's
Yeah.
talk." And then you have like 3.9 students that are like, "Oh, I need to go do a postback." I'm like, "No, your MCAT score is a
No, you
490.
don't.
That's what you need to work on." So, again, this is where kind of understanding your unique situation and trying to
Yep.
give you some of these things that we're talking about so that you can go back to your application and go, "Okay, this is what they talked about, here's what they said," and
Yep.
helping you try to figure it out on your own, what next steps that you need to do. And if you need help from us to walk through your application, great, we're there for that too. We'll talk about that later.
Mhm.
um just one final thought here on retakes, MCAT score retakes. Similar to reapplying to medical school, there's this idea that if you need to retake the MCAT more than once, it's a bad thing, and that's just false. So
Where
there
again,
are,
same thing with reapplying. I think I'm going to say the same thing you are then. The,
yeah,
the
go
the
ahead.
problem is when you rush it and there's no change or it gets worse.
Yep. Ideally, you can take it once just because it's expensive and painful. There's at least one school that I know of that says taking it more than 3 times is non-competitive, which to me that language means don't apply.
Yep.
Um, so there are some weird things at that. All right. So, activities. Why are activities so important? I'm gonna let you talk for a second. I hear my doorbell. Hold on one second.
Okay, I'll take this one. So, activities. I think it's very, very important. This is, in my opinion, activities is where an admissions committee will determine your readiness to become a physician, not to go to medical school. I think academics kind of determines your readiness to go to medical school to navigate through the curriculum. Activities to me is your readiness to become a physician. You have taken the time to understand what they're doing, why you want to do it. I hope it helps solidify for you the reason, the idea of why you want to become a physician. And to me, and I'll be very frank with you, outside of academics, activities is where I used to make decisions. I have been very open about this. So what I mean by that is when I read an application, whether I was voting on it, whether I was considering it for an interview, I would do a cursory glance at the academics. If the academics were solid and kind of met whatever internal metrics I had in mind, I moved quickly through and got to the activities. And I used to say this all the time, I would live in the activity section. What have you done? What clinical experiences have you had? What shadowing have you done? Research, leadership, community service. Why did you do it? What did you learn from it? How long have you done it? Did you check a box because you think you had to hurry up and do something? Or is this something you really care about and have shown me over time that you know that you're ready to go to medical school? And so activities are like as important to me. That's like, in my opinion, the other half of the application. It's the big part of the qualitative side of your application. Clinical experience. I talk about clinical experience, to me, is one of the more important experiences that you have to attain to be successful in gaining admission. And clinical experience can be fairly all encompassing. I know we have shadowing as its own bullet point. When I'm working with students and I talk to them, I kind of lump a lot of things into clinical experience and then we break it down piece by piece. Clinical experience could be paid work. It could be like you're an EMT or a medical assistant or a nurse or a nursing assistant, a scribe, a caregiver, anything like that. So any kind of paid clinical position is certainly clinical. Volunteer experiences in a clinical realm counts as clinical experience as well. And what that looks like is volunteering in a hospital, volunteering in hospice, volunteering in a free clinic. But all of it kind of lends itself toward clinical experience. Ryan, I was just telling them that I used to make decisions out of the out of the experiences. That was where, like, for me, the heavy weight outside of academics landed.
Yeah.
The importance behind it.
Yep. And that's it's funny. I could tell the story all the time how you and I met. Right, you were giving a talk about reapplying to medical school and lack of clinical experience. This conversation is how you came into my radar, and so it's such an important aspect of the application that I think students either just don't understand the importance of it or don't have the bandwidth or make the bandwidth to do it, and they have good grades and they have tons of research and they're like, oh, medicine and being a doctor is all about science and being smart, therefore my 4.0, 520, whatever MCAT score and years of experience in the research lab, that's what's going to get me into med school. And that just doesn't work nowadays.
It doesn't. So. I guess this is my naive moment of life here. I like to think that admissions committees are looking at people who want to be of service, who really want to work with patients and understand, because we have a wide swath of patients that people could see, whether they're underserved, whether they're fairly wealthy, whether, they come in all different shapes, sizes, financial brackets, languages, cultures. And when you have a set of clinical experiences, you understand how to navigate through that. And I think schools place a lot of value on that.
Yeah.
And so, I've had plenty of conversations with the high earning student, the 4.0, 520s, and they're like, I've applied twice and I have gotten no interviews. And tell me about your clinical experience. Oh, well, I just started after your application.
Well, you wouldn't be talking about one specific student that we both know
not
about.
At all. Oh my God.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate because they've obviously worked their butt off, but have been led astray.
Yeah.
All right.
Activities. And so I want you to have, you have to have the activities. Yeah. And the other one to me is community service. I think clinical and community service are, like, to me, the priorities above a lot of things.
Yep. Yeah. That is it. Yeah. All right. And then secondary turnaround time, there's this general rule of thumb of 2 weeks. It's for most schools, there's no strict deadline, but similar to the primary application, earlier typically the better, as long as you're not rushing it.
Okay. And you answer the question.
Answer the darn question.
Answer the question.
All right. Some more subjective stuff. This crazy personal statement. I might have written the book on the personal statement, the Pre-Med Public Guide to the Medical School Personal Statement. Get it where fine books are sold. The personal statement is one of those things that we put a lot of weight into because we think it's important for a committee member, a reviewer, to understand what your um,
Motivations.
motivations are, right? And I was just reading an essay today for our series PS or BS, which if you haven't seen, psbs.com will take you there. And the essay was so overly focused on why physician versus something else, and it was just like, I need all of the knowledge and I need all of the science, and I can only get that through medical school. And I'm like, you're missing the point here of the personal statement. And so um in your years reviewing applications and looking at this kind of stuff, what was an immediate like no for a personal statement? Is there?
I think I've said this one before. I mean, an immediate no is if I really cannot understand why you want to be a doctor, kind of how you got to a place of being a doctor. But I mean, I was working with someone very recently and I read their statement. I'm like, well, this is just your narrative journey. I don't know why you want to be a doctor from this. I mean, I can see how you got to it, but what's the purpose of adding all of this? And so I don't love those, but I think the probably the immediate no is the one who thinks they need to stand out in a certain way. And what I mean by that is they get a little too creative in the way they write
Oh,
it.
creative. Yeah.
Poetry, letters, you know, songs and prose and various things. And I'm just like, why are we doing this? You, if I guess my rule of thumb is if I totally remember your personal statement, it's probably a bad one.
Yeah.
And I actually did tell someone recently, and they're like, well, I don't want to do the same thing that everybody else does. I'm like, why do you think everybody else does it? It probably
Yeah.
works.
Because it
You
works.
standing out is probably not the way to go here.
Yeah.
Your journey, your reflection is what makes you good, not the something flashy and crazy.
Yeah. Be easy on those personal statements, and the knee jerk reaction of like, oh, everyone does that, so I'm going to do something different. That's not the right reaction in this situation.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
very rarely the right reaction in this party.
yeah. Activities we talked about, secondary answers. We talked about timing, right? But subjectively, the answers themselves. You mentioned earlier, right? Answer the
Yes.
question.
Yep.
Uh, so that's a big one. And then school lists, if you go onto Reddit and Student Doctor Network and you read a post, it's like, oh, I have a 4.0 and a 520 and I didn't get into any schools. The immediate response from most students is, oh, your school list must be bad. And I almost never go to that. What is your thought on it?
Uh, yeah, I mean, I look at it at the end just to kind of see where, but I agree with you that I don't know if that's really the huge factor. Again, a 4.0 and a 520 not get into medical school, go back up to bullet point number two, something is missing.
Yeah,
Something is missing because if it's truly a 520 and a 4.0, all the big ones, the ones that person probably applied to, the top programs, they're going to snatch those. That's the first person to get snapped up. And so if they didn't get an interview at least, then there's a gap. I mean, that's my first assumption is there's a gap somewhere.
yeah, yep, 100%. There's the gap. The subjective nature of all this.
Yeah,
So
there's an
yeah.
absolute.
All right. So school list. So the $1 million question, Christine. When should a student think about reapplying if they are in this situation where they are in the last part of the application cycle? They don't have any interviews left, maybe. They're maybe on a wait list or maybe just haven't heard anything from anyone.
Mm-hmm. You want me to answer that question?
Yeah.
When they're ready. So I can qualify that and I can give you what that means, but
Yeah.
that's really what
Do
the
it.
answer is when you're ready. If you applied in this cycle, let's use, and let's say your metrics, you don't have to be a 4.0 and a 520. Maybe your metrics are solid, 3.5, 3.6. and you have a 512 MCAT. Let's use the national average of the numbers for the most part. 3.7 and a 512 MCAT, and you got no interview invites or you really didn't get anywhere, you need to assess your application and think back to all the things that we just talked about: clinical, community service, research, letters of recommendation, personal statement, how you wrote it, what did you write in that answer for the secondary. You have to look at all of those aspects and truly have a critical moment with yourself to figure out what went wrong. Do you have a gap? And a lot of times I sit down with students, even when I'm working with them as they begin their cycle. Do you have any things you are worried about that you would like to tell me out of front? Are you worried about anything academically? Are you worried about anything with your activities? I will ask them that first thing when we first start meeting. What are you worried about in terms of your application? And they're like, I don't really think I'm worried about anything. Great, let's talk. Or, and if they lead out with, I might be a little bit light on clinical, or I'm a little bit light in volunteering, I'm going to start digging in on that. What does that mean? Because what they think is light may not be what I think is light, but I want to get their process on this. And you, if you're thinking about when to reapply, you need to have those conversations with yourself, with your advisor, with one of us, with somebody, to understand what went wrong.
Yeah.
And if you can, if it's just unfortunately, a poorly written application, that's easily, and you can probably reapply in the next cycle. That's an easier fix. If it's a retake of an MCAT and you have a date scheduled, that, I mean, I say this with all respect, that's probably an easier fix too.
Yeah.
But if you are 100 hours of clinical and you just started it after you submitted your application, that's where you have to really assess what you have done and if you are ready in the next cycle. That's where it starts really getting dicey.
Yeah. And not necessarily just a number standpoint, but do you have enough experience to reflect on it, to write about it, to talk about it?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. We're going to get to some questions and we're going to test our platform here. I haven't used this platform in a couple months because we used it for MapsCon back in October. And so I think you all should be able to raise your hand and we can potentially bring you on to talk. If we can
Somebody
see
did at the
some sort
bottom.
of, hey, look at that. There we go. So we'll figure that out. All right, cool. So if you want to ask your questions, stay tuned. We're going to do that. But if you're potentially interested, if you are going to reapply and you're interested in working with us, right? We have a small team like Dr. Crispin here, former admissions directors of admissions committee members, senior admissions officers. We are very different than lots of the other people out there that are using medical students or residents as their quote unquote experts. So Christine and 4 of the 5 people are full-time. The one part-time person, Dr. Wright, is retired. And so he's enjoying his part-time life working as an advisor. And so, yeah, you can take a little, it's missing the G on advising. Look at that typo right there. Quality control these days. That's what happens when you edit a PowerPoint at, 11 o'clock last night when I was doing it.
Nice.
We pride ourselves in being a content marketing company, meaning we put out lots of content to get you to know who we are. And then if you want to work with us, awesome. If you learn a lot from our content and you don't need to work with us, even more awesome. So Pre-Med Playbook are my book series that I've written. Application Renovation is probably what I'm most known for on YouTube, where I break down students' applications and try to figure out what went wrong. If you're on this call and you would like to be a part of Application Renovation, I am actively seeking new applications to review, and we have a different model so that you don't have to be on video with that recording. You can be there, but you don't need to be on video to make it a little bit less vulnerable for you. And then Pre-Med Office Hours is our weekly live stream on YouTube. You can go to premed.tv is our URL for our YouTube channel. So go check it out. All right. And then if you're a parent, you'll know about the parent group when we do weekly stuff there. Applicationrenovation.com/session is a 30-minute session that the sale ends in 2 days, I think. 30-minute session with one of our advisors to actually go through line by line through your application and try to figure out as objectively and subjectively as possible to figure out next steps for you, more specifically, right? We can talk generally about the application, but if you want to spend 30 minutes with one of our advisors, applicationrenovation.com/session for that. All right. Yeah. Email team@medicalschoolhq.net. So let's go ahead. I'm going to pull off this, and we got one request here to join. Let's see how it works. Hopefully they want to join and weren't just raising their hand to test it out.
Test it out.
Yeah.
Surprise.
Yeah. If you want to come on and ask some questions, go ahead and raise your hand. And then there's a little bit of a setup process, because once I add you, then you just got to give permission to the site to do your audio. I don't know if video works as well. All right, let me go through the questions as well. Kira, I'm unsure about how to go about revising my personal statement. How would you recommend that? Yeah, so Christine, if someone didn't get in, they have a personal statement that they think is great, do they need to revise? What should they do?
I mean, if you feel your statement is reflective of your motivation and really does answer the question, I don't know. I don't think you always have to rewrite it. I think it really depends, because again, that may not be the reason you didn't get in. So I think, I generally would encourage somebody to think about what other experiences you've done between the time you submitted the application and 1 year later, because if there's anything that has changed or adjusted, it's certainly possible that you would want to rewrite it. But I think the most important thing out of the gate, if you're thinking about revising it, is what is the message of the original personal statement that somebody else can somebody else tell you why you want to be a doctor if they read your personal statement? And if they can't really tell you that, and even if you think it's great and well written, does it answer the question that you need it to answer?
Yeah. Okay. Samantha, is just retaking the MCAT and improving enough to reapply if you feel as if everything else is solid? And if I used your services for personal statement and feel I have a solid personal statement, then does it look bad without changing it? All right. So Samantha, if you used us for personal statements, probably fantastic. But you mentioned, right, Christine, one of the easier fixes potentially is just retaking the MCAT if that's the limiting factor.
That's the problem. Yeah. And potentially, if that is the problem, and you feel very confident in the rest of it, obviously you'll have to adjust the dates. Again, I always would encourage you, though, to look at the reflections you did a year ago and think about, has anything changed or adjusted? Are you still going to use those same most meaningfuls? Do you feel that the experiences you included in your personal statement really do convey or solidify why you want to be a doctor? If you feel confident in that, I don't think you always have to rewrite it, because potentially your goals for going to become a doctor don't necessarily change year to year. They could be enhanced a little bit, but I would always look at the experiences to make sure that the reflections you included are still kind of reflective of where you are right now, and adjust the dates, add anything new, because I like to think that you continued working over the year, even if you didn't get in this first time.
Yeah. Adam asks, I noticed some secondaries that ask something like, if you are a reapplicant, what has changed since last year? What kinds of things are they looking for? Or is that applicant dependent? Yeah, that's applicant dependent, right?
Applicant dependent.
Is what, number one, how self-critical are you, right? Last year when I applied, here's where I was struggling and here's what I've done to fix it. So yeah, definitely applicant dependent there.
Yep.
Again, if you want to raise your hand and join us for a more in-depth conversation, you can do so. Hitham, for writing my personal statement, I spent a lot of time writing and rewriting it, incorporating feedback. I'm not sure how much I would change it if I had to rewrite it. I've heard that when reapplying, you're supposed to rewrite the personal statement activities. What should the next steps to make the proper improvements for the personal statement? Yeah. So again, we've talked a bunch about the idea of rewriting a personal statement, I generally am like, even if it's good, massage it. Just
Yeah.
kind of go through. You're a different person this year than your previous application. So how do you go about doing that? Um, if you get an interview and then a rejection, what are some of the possible reasons for the schools that offered you an interview? Also, what does it mean for your stats? Um, there are lots of reasons why
So many
students get
reasons.
rejected after an interview. What are some of the more common ones?
Well, the first one that comes to mind is the interview was probably not great. Could have been a bad interview, that
Mhm.
maybe you didn't connect well with the interviewers, or not knowing who you are, not knowing your motivations, not really seeing that you were a good fit for their program as well as they thought you were when they invited you to interview. Um, and it again, this goes back to being school dependent. Some schools, depending on exactly how they review how they review post interview. Like when I did it, both schools I worked at would kind of go back through the entirety of your application again, and again, review your academics, review your activities, review your interview reports, your letters, all the things you put together. And then they'll make another assessment based on the interview report. I mean, I had a specific method that I used when I looked post interview, when I was going into committee, and what swayed me one way or the other. And so there are any number of reasons. And to be perfectly honest, sometimes you could be a very good applicant, but not a good fit for them. And I think that's a really hard thing to hear. And having had those conversations, um, we used to always take solace in the fact that somebody's got to take them because they're a great applicant. They're just not right for us.
Mhm.
And so sometimes that is why you got rejected post interview. Assuming, hit them, that you had a good interview, that you came out. How did you feel about your interview? Did you come out fairly confident, or did you know I had a hard time connecting with my interviewer? Because I've had some bad interviews where I literally just want to put my head on the desk and cry because I'm like, stop. And it's, you're watching the clock to give them the 30 minutes, but you're really trying to speed it along.
Yeah.
And I've had great interviews where an hour into this game, I'm like, okay, you got to go. You have to finish up and hurry up. I've kept you too long. And so you again, this is where self-reflection is key in these kinds of things. You have to kind of think about what happened at the interview, what went well, what could have been better, and what are aspects of your application that potentially are not as strong as you would hope.
Yeah. Um, let's talk about reusing letters of recommendations. That's actually not something that we talked about at all. Probably should be added to the list. Is
Yeah.
maybe you didn't get in because your letters of recommendations were terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Um, as part of Mapped Pro, students have access to my LORs where your letter writer can upload the letter to my LORs. We'll do a quick scan to make sure it's on letterhead, is dated, has a signature and contact info. And when I was reviewing a letter, I think 2 years ago, maybe, the letter was basically like, I have concerns about this student and their work ethic, and I'm not really sure why they asked me for a letter of recommendation. And I was like, wow, that is not going to be good.
I've
And
had a
and
few,
ethically,
very
like
few of those.
I'm not going to
Yeah,
tell
there's
the student. I can't tell the
mm-mm.
student don't use this letter. Um, Thankfully, right, very few, because most letter writers in that situation will just say no. So I don't even know why the
Right.
letter writer said yes in this situation. Like that was pretty
Yeah.
vindictive. um, uh, but letters of recommendations, if a student's not getting in, should they think about their letter writers as a potential reason to update
Um,
them?
I think they should always think about their letter writer. So sure, again, I think everything is on the table on a reapplication. Should they reuse a letter? Maybe, maybe not. So the letters that are potentially that could be reused, if you are confident it's a good letter. Let me just preface that. Like the person, it's going to be the science faculty, because there are some schools that are very specific about what they want submitted. Two science, one non-science types of things, where I mean, there's only so many science faculty that you have. So what else are they going to do? But you should certainly feel very confident that they at least didn't damage you in the letter that they wrote. It may not be
Mm.
the best or strongest letter, but at least they didn't damage you.
Yeah.
Other letters, research PIs, mentors. Those are the ones that you really need to assess is, can you get one that's better? Is there one that's more current? Is the letter from your PI from when you were a freshman in college and did research with them? Is there anybody else that's 5 years advanced that could write a letter for you? So I definitely don't want you just to do a wholesale reuse. I think you need to kind of go through each letter, the person, and kind of think about how they represent you, how you know them, how well you know them, and what potentially they would have written.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the very least, read it.
Update the date.
Have your letter writers just re-upload the same letter with an updated date. At a bare minimum is ideal. I use the line that your letters should be about who you are, not who you were. So having that
Right.
updated date is I think pretty crucial as well.
And I think if you are a early college student, freshman, sophomore, even to some degree a junior, and you're not applying in the coming cycle, it is on you to get to know your faculty. I've had this conversation many times. You have got to be the person that reaches out to them. You have to go to office hours. You have to engage and develop some sort of a relationship so they
Yeah.
feel confident writing your letter. And it's not just going to be Ryan came to class. He sat in the front row. He came every day. And I teach this kind of a class, this many lectures. Only 3% of my students get an A minus and the whole 5 paragraphs of what they do in their class. And then Ryan came to class, sat in the front, and he got an A. Okay, thanks. And so you want something beyond that. You want them to know you.
Yeah. Okay. Vanessa asks, how do I go about professor letters of rec if I graduated 5 years ago? Using those professor letters, having a committee letter, actually. So some schools have kind of a variation process, an alternate process of letters if you're a super non-trad like this. So I would reach out to the schools you're interested in and just ask them, or at least go to their websites and check. I know of one school, I always talk about them because I love how transparent they are. Sam Houston State College of Osteopathic Medicine in Houston, they will say if you've been out of medical school for more than a year or been out of undergrad for more than a year, that their standard letters don't apply, and you can just apply with whatever you have. So
That's
just
nice.
yeah.
And last year, I think it was last year or the year before, I had a student who was applying and they got pushback from a letter that they needed a letter from a professor in their major who taught them. I mean, it was like so super specific.
Yeah.
And I remember asking, I'm like, well, didn't Dr. So-and-so send you a letter? He's like, yes. I'm like, he's the chair of your department. What else do they want?
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm like, please email them, tell them who he is, and ask them if they are sure that you need another letter. And of course, they accepted the letter once they. I'm just like, dude,
Yeah.
you got the top dog. I don't know who else to get.
Yeah. Someone didn't take any effort to figure that out.
Yeah.
Oh well. Samantha asks, have you ever had a student that you were borderline on or had great experiences but lower stats, but interviewed and their interview really made them stand out over stats? Is it just casual conversation and chemistry that makes a student a good interviewer?
Yes.
Thoughts on that? Yeah. Yes, to all of that. Yeah.
I've had plenty of students. I mean, I think I've told you I've had students that I've done mock interviews with recently who have lower stats, yet are interviewing. One's interviewing at UCSF, one's interviewing at UCLA, one's interviewing at UCSD or UC Davis. And all of those stats are 516 or better. And these people have conceivably much lower stats than what are posted. And they have the interviews. And when I did the mock interviews, there's no doubt why they got their interviews. Absolutely. It's what they bring to the table, how they presented themselves. Is it casual conversation and chemistry? I mean, that's always nice, but I think it's also on the interviewer to try to make it that way. It's not always going to be that way. Sometimes the student really just comes across really well, but they have done the work. They've They've got the experiences, because if the stats are not as strong, what's sealing their deal is the experiences they've attained. And they're able to really talk about those experiences in a way that demonstrates their passion and what they care about. To me, that's by far my favorite student.
Yeah.
And that's the one I would fight for, because obviously there's going to be one person on the committee who looks at those stats and is like, they're not qualified. Yes, they are. And you got to fight. That's where the admissions committee has to fight to make
Yeah.
that work.
Yeah. All right. Da-da-da-da. Again, if you guys want to raise your hand, come on and go a little bit more in depth, we can chat about that. What are some of the activities that will help in reapplication, EMT, doc shadowing, volunteering, et cetera? That's where we need to know. Think about a GPS, right? We know where you want to go, but we don't know where you're starting from, so we can't give you the proper directions.
I'm not sure who asked that question, but I would say if you go back to all the buckets, Ryan, on the slideshow that you gave, you talked about clinical, shadowing, research, community service. If you look at those bullet points and you ask yourself, what is my clinical experience? Is it good? What do I have? Can I talk about it? Do I feel it's reflective of what I present? Yay or nay? Shadowing. Do I have shadowing? Shadowing is probably of this particular list, it's not as important because it's also hard to come by still. So don't overthink shadowing. If you have good clinical experience working as an EMT or whatever, that should cover shadowing. Research. Research is not the most important, but some schools want it. I usually tell students if they have the opportunities to do it, because I think there's some qualities that you can gain from that, but it's not the end all be all. Leadership, I think leadership is important. Do you have leadership? How did you portray it? Did you write about it in your application? Community service, I own it. I think it's important. Do you have it? Service to a community. Please do not confuse community service with volunteering in a hospital. They are different to me. And I think they are different to most admissions committees.
Yeah.
So do you have service to a community that is not necessarily clinically related? If you do not, that could be your gap. So when you look at this and you start thinking about your activities, what doesn't seem to be as strong as something else? If you feel it's not very strong, I guarantee you we do too.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Asher asked a while ago, how wide is too wide when choosing a school list? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I do have thoughts there, because the first thing that a medical student will tell me is, I'll go anywhere. I'm like, no, you won't. No, you won't. And I joke about this, as you know, Ryan, I live in Southern California and I am a weather brat. Okay. I'm spoiled. I like 75 degrees and warmer.
Yep.
We had our meeting the other morning. Two of us were whining and complaining because it was below 60. And so my vision of going to a medical school in cold state USA, and you guys all live in some cold state USA, because anything outside of my little warm area is cold state. I'm like, oh, not a fan, not a fan. But if you are from a rural area, are you going to want to go to a larger city school? You might not. Are you from a city and you're going to go to a rural school? You might not. Don't put yourself in those kinds of situations. You don't want to live there. Don't. Full stop. I don't care how receptive they are to an out-of-state resident or how friendly they are or what your stats say. You are potentially going to live there for at least 4 years. You could also end up going to residency there.
Yeah.
If it's not where you want to be, don't be there. I think you need to consider if there's any support systems there and all these other things. So can it be too wide of a net? Yes, because you cannot apply to every single school, and you should not assume that you'll go anywhere. You have to be honest about that. And I think that's usually where I tell people to start. Where would you actually want to live? Let's start there. We may have to go out further. We may have to come in further. But if you tell me I live in New York City and you put, and there's nothing wrong with the state, but if you put it like Nebraska, are you going to go to Nebraska from New York City? That's a big change in life. Are you sure that's what you want to do? Yes. And this is my reason why. Great. Next. So you just have to be real, you have to be realistic with yourself. Look at the cost of the school. There are some state schools, even if they're friendly to out-of-state residents, they have exorbitant out-of-state fees. Can you afford
Colorado.
100,000? The one that comes to mind was Michigan State. to be like 100 grand a year for out-of-state residents, and you could not establish residency.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's a lot of money. If that's a factor, and I'm not sure for who it isn't, but if that's a factor for you, then maybe that's not a place you apply to. So you've got to be realistic with the net that you cast. And I think there
Yeah.
are some very out-of-state friendly schools. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania has a ton. Illinois has, I mean, there's a lot of schools that I'm always going to say, look here, look here, look here to see if it's something that's right for you. But you've got to also be realistic with yourself.
Yeah. That is true. I was looking on Michigan State's website. I don't see it right away. Their website's confusing. All right. Any other questions that we didn't get to? Anyone want to jump on and have a conversation
Well, come on, be
about
brave. Be brave. We will not make you feel bad at all.
Again, medicalschoolhq.net. Actually, let me put the application renovation one in there.
And we have a person.
I see that. So that session is the $99 session that we have. Let's get Maya on, see if she can get in here. They can get in here. We also have a sale that just started today on our single session, just regular old session. 30 and 50-minute sessions. All right. Maya, hello. Can you unmute yourself?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yep.
Hi, thank you both for your time and for doing this. As I mentioned in the intro, I'm a non-traditional student or applicant rather, a career changer. My first career was like in real estate, commercial real estate as a project manager. So building buildings, building office spaces, stuff like that.
Nice.
And I guess my biggest concern, I do have one interview. It was last week. So they told us 4 to 6 weeks to hear back. So I am hopeful for that one because I think the interview went really well and it was just very good chemistry. The people that I interviewed with they said they were impressed with my MCAT, which I thought it was kind of middle of the road, my MCAT, but I felt like that was a good thing to hear.
Great.
I guess my biggest question is with reapplying, and I'm not sure that I'll have to yet. I'm still hopeful. What I guess are the biggest things that I would need to change? My GPA isn't stellar, but I also have like a ton of credits because I've been out of school for, almost 20 years now from my original undergrad. So I don't know if that's like special masters. Is that just retaking the MCAT? My GPA is like 2.9. So
Yeah.
I think it's in a tough spot. There's no way that my GPA is bumping to 3.5 or anything like that. I think my GPA is going to be what it is. I just have to live with that. I think the rest of my application was pretty good from the feedback that I had gotten. So I'm just not sure what to be looking to tweak.
What is the trend in your GPA?
So I had
last
really
20, 40,
bad
60
freshman
credits.
year. Probably like 3.5.
Okay. And then
I did a like do it yourself post back.
So you did do a do-it-yourself post-bac. Okay.
Yeah.
And what was
How
that
did you do in your
GPA?
post-bac? Yeah.
That was like 3.57.
Okay, so not stellar.
How many units did you do for that?
What was the question?
How many units was the post-bac?
Oh, let's see.
Roughly.
Yeah, you can guess. Doesn't have to be perfect.
Maybe 45.
Okay.
So decent amount.
Yeah.
I don't think you can do anything else with your academics either. I think you are where you are.
Yeah. I mean, potentially an SMP just being a different type of GPA. And how long ago was your post-bac work?
I just finished like in
Just
December.
finished.
Yeah.
What do you think held you back from getting a 3.9 versus a 3.57 or whatever it was?
I have 2 kids. I was working full time.
See, those darn kids. All right. Yeah. So
They're rough, I tell you.
there's some issues there. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think short of doing like an SMP or some heavy master's program, but again, I think if you're gonna do it, you're gonna need to make sure that you're ready to get as close to a 4.0 as possible.
Okay.
Getting another 3.5 through that wouldn't be useful. So yeah, I think you got an interview, just one interview this cycle.
Yeah, I haven't heard from 3 schools yet. So I also
Yeah.
don't know if that means rejection or if no news is still like you're in a pile that they're kind of like stewing over.
You're just hanging out until they finish the cycle.
Okay.
Yeah. As Christine used to do to students, you're in the pile of we really don't want you, but we don't want to get rid of you because we're too riddled with anxiety to reject you yet.
There's some truth to that.
I speak nothing but the truth.
I wore my Dream Killer t-shirt for a reason.
So not probably assume rejection with those ones.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maya just.
Oh, here's one other question. So Maya, when did you finish your post-bac?
I just finished, in the fall of 24.
Okay. So this is a very common mistake that I see students make is they apply while in their post-bac with the hope that medical schools will say, trust me, bro, or they'll accept, trust me, bro, I'm going to do well. I'm going to send you updates. And so you basically applied before proving yourself academically. And so that I'm glad I asked that because that's a very common thing that students, they'll apply while doing their academic work to show academic improvement. And most medical schools just don't care. They are going to look at the snapshot that you have now, and they're not going to care what you're doing during the cycle. And so applying this upcoming cycle, now that your post-bac body of work is done, I think carries more weight.
Okay.
Agreed.
So maybe you don't need to do anything. Is your MCAT score still
valid?
Valid? Yeah, I was gonna think viable.
Yeah,
I
just took it in June.
Perfect.
Okay. And you're happy with your score? You think it's reasonable?
I think it's reasonable. I think I could have done better. Chem Phys is my best subject area. And when I took the test, I was totally like freaking out for the first 5 minutes. And so my Chem Phys score wasn't as good as it had been trending, although I had done better in the other sections. So I mean, could retake.
That happens.
Yeah.
And you feel your clinical work, your like all the extracurriculars and the qualitative stuff are pretty solid?
I think that's probably the strength of my application, actually.
Then I would probably agree with Ryan on probably the fact that your post-bac was in progress and not like solidified did not help you.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Was your last semester of your post-bac stronger, weaker, about the same as your first couple semesters or work?
Probably about a little bit better.
Okay.
I guess.
Cool. All right. Well, good luck. And if we can help with essays or anything, let us know. That's what we're here for.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Julius asks, how can I get involved with application renovation? So applicationrenovation.com/apply is the official way to do it. If you want to shortcut that, just shoot me an email with your application. You don't have to redact it. I just can take a quick glance at it and go, oh, yeah, I would love to do this one for application renovation. And then we can do the full redaction and all that good stuff and set up some time there. Rezwana, what could be some reasons if I'm out of state and AdCom asks, how am I connected? If I don't show them the connections, how much of a chance would I have? Yeah, this is such a kind of a case-by-case basis with schools, right? If it's a public state school and they want in-state people or people with really strong ties, it really is just.
They probably won't interview those people. If they don't have the ties, they're probably not going to interview you.
Yeah. Yep. So they're asking for a reason. And it was funny. I was talking to a parent earlier and the parent was like, I really don't understand. Like, if the student's good enough, accept them. What does it matter what their ties are? And so I explained, I'm like, well, the school's getting funding from the state to serve the people of the state with the assumption that students who
You're going to live in that state,
train in that school will stay in that state and serve the constituents of that state. And she was like, oh, that makes sense. And I explained, right, if you look at in-state versus out-of-state tuition differences, I said the medical schools typically are getting the same amount of money per student. The difference that you see in-state versus out-of-state, the state's making up that difference in that tuition. And so that may not be true for every state or every school, but having a conversation with a public school in one of the states, he explained, he's like, our tuition difference is $30,000 in-state versus out-of-state because the state gives us $30,000 for each in-state student. I'm like, oh, yeah. that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. But I mean, even some schools give regional preference. Like, again, in California, UC Davis wants people who want to live and work in the Central Valley. Riverside, UC Riverside wants people who want to live and work in that area. Yep. So, I mean, that's where the mission, like when you're choosing your school list, mission has to come into play too. Because now this is where they are transparent. They will flat out tell you, we want people who want to train and live here. Yep. We give preference to these people, to these residents. And if you don't have, I mean, that usually comes through either in the primary or in the secondary. Like, they're not going to advance you very far in that process if you don't meet those requirements. Those are really baseline requirements for most schools.
Yeah. All right, friends, I think we have come to an end. I sent lots of links out. Applicationrenovation.com, again, is our YouTube series. I'm really shooting for a play button. I need 100,000 subscribers on YouTube, so go tell your friends. I want a play button just for my ego. So go subscribe, go watch those. Students binge watch those application renovation videos to learn about kind of our thought process, my specific thought process with an application. And if you think your writing can be improved or your interview prep can be improved, come and talk to us. That's what we do day in and day out, helping students through the application process and pre-med process. So, yeah, hit them. I want to improve my application, but I'm concerned about my application being made public. That's everyone's fear. I don't know why. It's not a concern. How would that affect my reapplication? It wouldn't. The admissions committee people aren't watching my videos going, I know this application. But you can do a private session as well. So the private sessions that students pay for, those are not the ones that end up on the interwebs. So, all right, friends. Christine, Dr. Crispin, thank you for hanging out.
Dr. Gray, thank you.
We'll see you all. Thank you for coming and hanging out. We'll see you at our next workshop, hopefully, or maybe sooner. Bye, everyone.
Good, friends. Bye.